sexual or ethnic. It made him nervous, so he stuttered. But he could sing opera, but he stuttered. So when he got to the walk-up in New York City where Bob lived, a woman answered the door, large black woman, and he was so scared he couldn't talk for some reason. So he wanted Curlee to tell Bob the story. So what was it like for me to sit next to Bob Blackburn and go back and tell him a story about something that was so traumatic? I decided that was not my role. And I wasn't carrying that water, you know what I mean? But my point is that although we're making art objects, it is about our lived experience. It's about finding a way to bring our dream life into reality. And I believe that's what art making is really about. Now, in the printmaking medium, the other aspect of making the image is not just because that image is relevant, because it's speaking to your vision, but because you're making multiples, you can share it with your community. Printmaking is the most democratic form of art making. And you're in it right now. You buy a print, you look at it, you can see that it's signed by the artist. It's an original work. You know there's more than one by the edition number, and someone else can purchase that. Versus a painting that may be $50,000 or $15,000. So you can actually have access to the art world. So printmaking made that possible. Now in the case of African American artists, the ideal graphic imagery goes all the way back to perhaps 1773. The frontispiece by Sepio Moorhead for the published poems of Phyllis Wheatley. You've seen Phyllis Wheatley's poetry? There's a portrait of her. That was done by Sepio Moorhead in 1973. That was the first graphic work. Not much happened after that until Henry O. Tanner was in Europe, the turn of the century, early 1900s. He began to make etchings based on his paintings, and that was pretty much a European tradition. But African American artists weren't necessarily making prints at that time because they didn't have access to the equipment, to the opportunity, until the WPA program and the Harlem Workshop program. So Tanner, for example, did a piece, I think in 1914, The Rising of Lazarus. He did a small etching and also a large painting. That's a very famous painting. He also did, The Lion's Den, which won him the grand prize in Paris Salon. He was the first African American artist to receive international attention. But he also did prints because that was very much a European tradition, especially etchings and lithography. If you're familiar with the work of Picasso, Picasso did a lot of lino cuts, a lot of etchings. Toulouse-Lautrec, if you've ever seen anything about his work. But these artists always did prints. And they did prints because there were print dealers that were promoting those works. African American artists did not have access. They really didn't have access to mainstream art until the WPA program, the Works Project Administration, that was started by Franklin Roosevelt to employ artists like any other craftsman. Now they employed African American artists. And most often we think that's a very open and diverse and dynamic experience. But it was very much segregated. White artists belonged to the white guild and black artists belonged to the black guild, including Bob Blackburn and others. So although they were in the mural program, like Aaron Douglas, Hale Woodruff, or the print graphic arts program like Bob Blackburn, they were still segregated. And the salary, Bob used to tell me this, the salary was $22.50 a week. But what they did have is a space. And those spaces were created as community centers. Like the WPA program was at the library in Harlem, where Augusta Savage taught classes. And who was the most famous student? Jacob Lawrence. But also Bob Blackburn learned printmaking there as well. Well, those artists also began to have an environment in which they could collaborate together. So this becomes the key. And we have other master printers in the house with us right now, especially Jamaal, who works with other artists. So it's when they're working in collaboration with an artist. And Robert Rochberg described it this way, that he makes better work and more work when he works with a master printer than he does on his own. So the result of the collaboration is you have now 4 eyes, 20 fingers, 4 arms. You have the imagination of 2 minds. You have the skills problem solving of these different individuals. So you create something that is dynamic, and the intention is critical. You got to understand how important the intention is. We're standing in a space now with a clear mission and intention. And that intention, driven by Najee and his wife, is to create an environment that embraces you, that validates you, that acknowledges you. And in return, we validate his effort by collecting the work and supporting the institution. That's what the Harlem Renaissance was about. Not just singing our song, but singing our reality and having that community embrace our reality. There are more artists in Harlem than any other place. So you had Aaron Douglas that was able to support itself in Harlem. We're talking about African American artists in the 1930s. Lois Mailey Jones and others that could live and support themselves as visual artists. This was unheard of. And one way in which they did it, especially Hale Woodruff and others, was through the printmaking medium, because they could share that and bring people in. Well, Bob established the first nonprofit workshop in the 1950s, the Bob Blackburn Printmaking Workshop, that still operates to this day. And in that workshop, he invites artists to come in and create works, young artists. So I went in, I met artists from all around the world that were in that workshop. And I'll tell you a story. I worked with a number of major international artists. And I worked with the Venice Biennale representative from Greece. We did a project together. And we were talking about his coming to New York from Athens. And he said the first place he came was Bob Blackburn's workshop, because that was the only place that would welcome him. So when I got to Bob's, after meeting him and meeting all these other artists, I said, Bob, can you tell me where I might stay in New York City? He said, well, if you can't find a place to stay, you can stay here in the workshop. You can sleep on one of those big presses. So sleep on a press. He said, well, shit, Bearden slept on one, you can sleep on one. I said, okay. So what we're having is a legacy that's being put in place. And transferring a legacy, to me, not just by his words and his support, but by his mission. I'm witnessing his mission. I'm witnessing his value, his dedication. I get the second phone call. That phone call is from Robert Madison, who's the chairman of our department at Lafayette College. This was an elite college in eastern Pennsylvania. Calls Bob Blackburn and says, I just talked to Grace Hardigan. And Grace Hardigan, famous woman artist. I don't know if you know much about the artists that came in the scene, action painters in the 1950s, but they were on the front of Look magazine. There was only one woman artist, and that was Grace Hardigan. She had worked with Bob. So she told this Mr. Madison, the chairman of our department, call Bob Blackburn, asking for a recommendation. So he was on the phone, and Bob came up to me and says, there's someone I want you to talk to, Curlee. He didn't introduce him to anybody else in the workshop. He said, I want you to talk to him. So I got on the phone and I introduced myself. Now they were looking for someone, not just to do printmaking or to do art, but the art department was looking for someone to do that. But every department on campus was competing for this position. It was called a diversity position at that time. This is the 1990s. So I applied for the position. So I was competing against psychologists, philosophers, engineers, all kinds of disciplines. And so I did my presentation, and I decided to talk about a couple of things that they were not particularly aware of. Bertolt Brecht's chalk circle, the white chalk circle. And this is about racism and the reality of racism. I talked about Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, who explains how we feel about our existence. He had an ideal called being in time. And this ideal, and you do this, you just aren't aware that you're doing it. We reveal who we are at different moments. So some of us in here know you as a certain person. Family members know you as someone else. People that are intimate with you or close to you know you as another kind of person. So we're on an axis. And this philosopher believed that we show ourselves based on our comfort and our willingness to share ourselves with each other. We all know this is true. All right? Because our mama knows who we are, really who we are, right? Our lovers, sometimes they know who we are, but that's not always true. But anyway, you know who you are, and you control how that is being revealed to the public. So I decided to talk about that, but I did something uniquely different. I took black vernacular and used black vernacular to explain the same philosophical position. There was a saying in the hood when I was growing up, I be trying. Think about that, I be trying. Now that's not proper English, but that's profound. I be trying. That talks about your consciousness, your ambitions, your awareness of yourself, although it's black vernacular. Now, if you say that in the wrong environment where they're projecting this kind of perfect self, like I was at this Lafayette College with 96% white, they were a little nervous by that. But I knew what I was doing. So I was describing that philosophy and what we talk about our realities can be in our own experience, can be in our own vernacular. It doesn't have to be anyone else's, because we're having our own narrative, our own stories. And that's what this art is really about. So these African American artists who were doing printmaking were embracing their own stories. Now the Harlem Renaissance was a dual kind of dynamic. It was very positive in that they were embracing what they called the new Negro. And you know what the new Negro was. That was that Negro that was counter to the old Negro, which was the enslaved Negro. So this was only a short time after the end of slavery and Emancipation Proclamation. You think about Henry O. Tanner's banjo lesson. That was only a few years after the end of slavery that this painting was made, you know. So we're still talking about not having opportunities in the world, even at that time. But this opportunity was given as an exotic opportunity, and it still exists to this day. What I mean by exotic, we were there in entertainment. Josephine Baker was shaking her behind with bananas on stage. We were there in entertainment, their exotic entertainment. Sometimes you would have to go to Mary Brady's house. That's where the Harmon Foundation was located, and that's where these artists were given their opportunity. You would have to show the work to Mary Brady in the kitchen, and if it was Negro enough, she would let you come in. If it was promoting that view that they were celebrating. And some did it, but some countered it. They had a problem with Aaron Douglas because he was talking about blacks coming out of slavery. So they had a few problems with him, but a few others. Mason Hughes they had some problems with because he was speaking truth to them, not just perpetuating some notion they had in their minds, some entertainment. So to give you an illustration of this, these artists were given opportunity. Jacob Lawrence was one that was given opportunity. Benny Andrew told me this story when he first arrived in Harlem. He got a chance to go see Jacob Lawrence. Now Jacob Lawrence came from an impoverished background. You gotta understand where he came from. And he was the discovery of Elaine Locke at Howard University, which was a crucible of the Harlem Renaissance. Elaine Locke, you had Lois Mailou Jones, you had James Porter, who wrote the first text on African American art in 1943. It was his graduate thesis. It was the first book. And then his student came along, David Driskell, and built on that. But they were doing the first collection of African American art in the US, was at Howard University, brought in by Elaine Locke, a personal collection. So this was happening at Howard University. So they were creating this environment that celebrated it. But there was a double side to it, because it was tied to this notion that the Negro was one-dimensional, and that could be just for the entertainment of others. So that had to be challenged, and it was challenged, and it was really profoundly challenged by another group of artists that came out of Howard, related to Howard. That was Jeff Donaldson, and you know who Jeff Donaldson was, right? Afro-Cobra? Afro-Cobra. Badass artists, Kool-Aid colors. Kool-Aid, now who's drinking Kool-Aid but us, you know what I mean? Kool-Aid colors and the murals and making them accessible, the most democratic. Now Nelson Stevens was one of those who was my junior high school teacher. So, you know, and he used to come to me and say, well, Curlee, did I introduce you to art like this? I said, no, Nelson, it wasn't your art that you introduced me to. It was the way you walk, because he would walk with this pep walk. I don't know if you're too young to know anything about this. And he'd have a tweed jackets on with suede elbows, and he had them Italian shoes you could roll up and put in your pocket. I've never seen anybody dressed like that. It was serious. Nelson was serious. I said, no, it's your clothes, man, that did this to me, not your art. But I don't want to get off track with that. But you're still finding that the message is the same. How do we say to the world that we are relevant? How do we celebrate it? And how does the work stand as a testament to that? So these artists have to be celebrated, embraced, and understood. So I'm saying there's a legacy of also suffering too. Keep in mind, when David Driskell was teaching at Fisk, and he came in after working with Hale Woodruff and Aaron Douglas, they have what they call Negro Day in the South. You could only go to the museums on a Tuesday if you were black. One day a week was Negro Day. And sometimes he said there would be Klan raids on the campus. But look at what he did. He made us accept that artwork and that experience and that legacy. And he did it with the 2 Centuries show. Now, again, that's built on his teacher, James Porter. David does 2 Centuries, and the bicentennial show for LACMA in Los Angeles, 1750 to 1950. And he goes back and he captures artists that they didn't even know existed, including C.P.O. Moorhead and Phyllis Wheatley. So it captured this history and made this history institutional. And that show traveled around the country. So David Driskell was central to that. Now, why was David Driskell so important? He was the right person at the right time. And he answered the phone call. He was refined, soft-spoken. He was famous for his letter writings and his archive. His archives at the David C. Driskell Center. The letters that he wrote to these artists, to Aaron Douglas, to Elizabeth Catlett, this correspondence. So he was recording that history in a very personal way. Our history is captured in that. So the printmaking medium, again, allowed these artists to share their voice with the community. They went to Europe and studied with artists like Henry O. Tanner. Hale Woodruff went there and visited O. Tanner and paid homage. To show you how powerful, not powerful, but how popular Henry O. Tanner was. He was the first African American artist to get accepted into the Academy of Arts and Letters in New York City. And that was probably in he died in 1930, I think, so it was in 1920s, late 20s. The second was Huey Lee Smith, and that wasn't until the 1960s. You know who the third was? Richard Mayhew was the third. He was on the back wall. Then later, Faith Ringo and David Driskell. But these artists were trailblazers, groundbreakers. They were making things happen, and they were creating opportunity. So Bob Blackburn, as I mentioned, along with Lou Stoval and Alan Evans and others, created an environment where they could share not only their knowledge, but the technology, because printmaking requires technology. And the most important aspect of a master printmaker is problem solving. Think about this. When you look at an image, the artist has actually deconstructed that image and reversed it. So you may be looking at it and it's facing right, but the block is facing left. And if it's taken from an existing image in multiple colors like the Richard Mayhew, you have to deconstruct it and then reconstruct it. And during each process, you're printing a color per screen or a plate per color. So some of these images may have 40 colors. I've printed up to 60 colors in an image. 60 pulled different images, in addition of 100 correct. 60 different images, screens, of 100 pulls per. That's 600 pulls, or 6,000 pulls to get that addition. So it's labor intensive, and it has to be precise and controlled, and controlling the pigment, and also the pressure applied. So it's not just a simple thing, I made a print. It's an important process. And remember, on that press, that's 100 pounds of pressure per square inch. It's always been a metaphor for me. So people would ask me, why did I make printmaking? I said, well, I love the equipment. I love the physicality, because what it requires is an integration of your mind and your knowledge and skill, your heart, your passion, and your body. You bring all that into concert, and you move that plate through that press with a sheet of paper on with ink on the surface as the transfer of the image. The ink is on the matrix, and the ink is what's giving you the image. You pass it through that press at 100 pounds per square inch, and on the other side is the work of art. Is that not alchemy? The transformation? It's like a crucible of living, isn't it? We go through these pressures in life, and these pressures produce us as a personality. It makes us strong, resilient, survivors. So the printmaking medium is very much, for me, a metaphor for that. So those are those motivations, and for printmakers, they have become extremely important, especially master printers, for the production of art. So you see most artists in the show here, there's a phenomenal works on display. I especially love the pieces of the James Baldwin portraits, just phenomenal pieces. And what you have is, Steve Prince's work is phenomenal as well. Traci Mims' work, great work. So these artists are also establishing their legacy, their history, and they're sharing it with you. And these prints are collectibles. They are unique, they are originals. And sometimes we look at a print and we think of a reproduction, a facsimile, a giclée, but we're talking about an original print is done with one's hand. Now, we do use some digital technologies in prints now and photography, and I think that's fine, although the majority of the work must be done by hand, so that it's an authentic print. So that's one of those important issues when you look at a print. You can see an etching with an embossed edge. You can see the relief of a relief print. You can see the pigments for the serigraph or the lithograph. So it's good to learn how to look at them so you can understand exactly the medium and the process. That's very important. So, me and Najee have had these conversations about the work over the many years, about the different artists and the plates, and the work as legacy, as archive. Not just the thing that you buy because you think it's beautiful and hang on the wall, but it's something that you transfer to your family, to your descendants. It's also a mark about you and your values. When my kids come into my studio, especially my grandkids, they look at a work of art and they see what grandpa is thinking. And that's important to me. That's more important to me than having a wall, hang on the wall in a museum. So that third phone call. I got a phone call from a curator. In Cleveland, they were doing an exhibition at the museum for inviting 13 artists. And the call came from a curator who had been recommended to me by a dealer. I had shown with the dealer for a few years in a place called Little Italy. And if you're familiar with Cleveland, if you've ever been to Cleveland, especially in the 70s and 80s, Little Italy was all Italian. Not only Italian had the social clubs. You know what the social clubs were. A black person, a person of color, could not walk through Little Italy. It's a main street coming down to the institutions, the Severance Center, Music School, the art school. If you're a person of color, you could not walk down that road. Otherwise, you'd be beaten mercifully. So he decided to show my work at his gallery, which was in Little Italy. They threw garbage cans through his windows because this is a white man that was showing my work. He still shows my work to this day, and this is almost 35 years later. But he took a stand because he believed in art. He's the one that recommended me to the curator that made that call. So the curator said, I'm coming to the University, Kent State University, look at a lot of professors there, and I know you're finishing graduate school. I'd like to come there and look at your art also. They were going to make it simple. Just look at 6 professors and maybe 3 students, graduate students. I said, no, I don't want to do that. For 2 reasons. One, I didn't want to compete against my own professor. He said it was all right. He said to me, it was all right, Curlee, don't worry about it. I said, but no, I don't want to do that. Plus, I'd rather have him come into my space. So I invited him to my home in the neighborhood. And of course, he was a little nervous coming to the hood. He came in, he sat down, and he said, can you show me some of your work? And I went upstairs, I brought down some work. He turned on a tape recorder and he interviewed me, and I told him my story. He was intrigued by my story. I told him how as a young child, I was a baby with my mother's arms when she came from Mississippi on a train with 3 other children and a rucksack. That's all she had. And the first house residence was a garage, a converted garage. So that kind of story, and that wasn't just my story, it was a lot of stories for the second migration from the South. And he said, "Do you have more work?" I kept bringing work down. And he couldn't believe it. So they invited me to be in a show, 13 artists in this area, statewide. So we get invited to the home of the director of the museum after the reception. And we're talking, and I tell him I'm getting ready to leave and go to New York City. It's time for me to leave. And as I was leaving, the wife of the director asked me about my work. She says, I told her what pieces I had, and so she said, "Oh, I love that one piece." And she looked at her husband and said, "Tomorrow, the director of the museum, you go in there tomorrow and you buy that piece for the museum." That was the first piece I got into the museum collection. That was that third phone call. But what it taught me was this important lesson. You can't decide whether you're going to have opportunity, but you can decide whether you're ready for it when it arrives.
Say that.
And Najee is an example of that. So these artists were also making work sometimes without an audience. And I told a curator this once, you know, African American artists had a lot of freedom because nobody was buying their work. They could make anything they wanted to make. It didn't matter.
Right.
Because there was no market making demands on them. That's a little different now. But they had liberty to make, to work, and hang with each other. And we saw that with the Harlem Renaissance, we saw it with the Spio group, we saw it with Afro Cobra. These were artists that came together to celebrate their shared realities with no market. But they were driven to make art. Think about this, driven to make a work of art, with intention, to make a work of art, to get materials, to act on that material and to create something from their imagination and an act of creativity and passion to share with a viewer. To me, that is a hell of an assumption that there's validity in your existence. And that's what this is about. That's what Black Art in America is about the validity of our existence, the beauty of it, and the need to celebrate it. I'm gonna stop there. I got a lot of stories I can tell you if you want to draw me out. So you have to do some of that work. But I printed over 150 different artists. Lois Maybell Jones, Faith Ringo. I printed Faith Ringo for over 20 years. David Driskell, William T. Williams, Mel Evers, Sam Gilliam, Richard Mayhew, as I mentioned, Robin Holder. I could just go down the list of these major artists that I have printed. And there's a legacy through that relationship with those artists. And the question is, why would they work with me? Because whatever they said to me stayed with me. Whatever happened in that studio, that exchange stayed in that studio. I could create a space for them that totally validated them. Just embrace their active creativity, and that wasn't always happening. When Jakaya Booker came in my studio, she was terrified. Never made a print. I said, "But I can help you do this. Don't be terrified, you know." But Sam Gilliam and Mel Evers were in the studio at the same time. That made her nervous also. But it's to take that language and skill set that these artists have, these master printers, and to bring it into concert with that artist and create something that didn't exist before. And that's really what we are about, creating something that didn't exist before. And to me, it's really important, this idea of dreaming. Because we dream. Humans are animals that dream. But normally what our dreams are symbols of deeper feelings and concerns. We just have certain images in our mind that constitute our cinematic dream. But it's normally coming from someplace much deeper than that. So for us artists, we're bringing those dreams out of that darkness into daylight, and we're dreaming while we're awake. And that's very unusual, and we should all dream while we're awake. Question from anybody?
I've got a question. So, you've given us a brief history of, you know, who we are, where we come from, but you're also an artist. And one of
Yes.
my favorite series of yours is the Othello series.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that now?
Yeah, it's a series called Reimagine Othello in Sepia. I was in Venice. I've been there a number of times, but I was in Venice, and this was during the Biennale in 2011, and they were doing a special event in recognition of reflecting on Venice. So I said I wanted to do Othello. I had always read Othello and Shakespeare, and I was always struck by the dilemma that Othello had, both his dilemma with Desdemona, but also that Shakespeare wrote in a way where he wasn't able to be the heroic figure. If you know the story, he was coming in a general, he was coming to save the Venetian people from the invaders. He married Desdemona, got together with Desdemona, they hated him for being with Desdemona. They called him a beast, and they said all kind of racial things regarding General Othello. Now this was a real person, not Othello, but Shakespeare was inspired by a black ambassador, African ambassador that was in Venice, and was inspired by that story. But he wrote it with Othello failing, and I didn't like that. So they asked me, what did I want to do in reflecting on Venice? I said, I'm doing Othello. They said, okay. So a part of this, they had 4 artists there, and a part of this, we were going to meet the mayor of Venice. So we go to the mansion of the mayor of Venice, and we're standing and we're talking, and I get introduced to the mayor, and the mayor said, what are you going to do your work on? I said, Othello. He said, come here, I want to show you something. We go to a balcony, and there's a palace, a small little palace. He said, that's Othello's home. So for them, Othello was real. I would go to the plaza sometimes, and they would say, ciao, Othello. So I did Othello in black, sepia. So I did Othello thinking about his Moorish background. He was a Moor. So what his betrayal by Desdemona required a certain act from a Moor, and which he did. But I redrew that and told that story from the perspective of the Moor. I discovered that a number of major European artists had done Othello. Jericho had done Othello, but nobody had done Othello, African American had done Othello visually, period. Now we've seen Othello performed on stage by Lawrence Fishburne and a couple other people, but it had never been portrayed visually in art by an African American until I did it. So we had this actually exhibited in a gallery in Venice while I was there. So that's where Othello Suite comes from. So it's 40 in addition. There's 10 images in the series that tell the story of Othello. One Kiss Before Death, Sweet Desdemona. And there's also the book that goes along with it. That is poetry and also titles to each image, and an introduction by Ian Smith, who's an expert on Othello. And I'll tell you about Ian Smith. I did a collaboration with him, and we talked about Othello, the work we did. We talked about Othello at an international conference in Hawaii. We did it in Martha's Vineyard. We did it in Italy. He discovered, I don't know if you know the story, but supposedly Othello's mother gave him a hanky with strawberries on it. And supposedly that hanky Othello gave to Desdemona as a gift. But the hanky represents the loss of virginity, so you can imagine what that was about. Ian, we're talking about centuries of them describing it this way. Ian discovered that it never existed, Dr. Ian Smith, that it was a color musk cloth. It was African fabric. It was never this strawberry piece of cloth. It was African. He was able to document it, so he actually changed the history. This is African American scholar that did this. So I collaborated with him, so that Othello was about telling that story from our perspective. Why shouldn't it be told from our perspective, from our reality? That's what Reimagining Othello in Sepia is about. Yeah, got a question here.
You talked about legacy, and you talked about some of the folks who mentored each other. Who are you mentoring, and what is your legacy?
Well, I got a mentee in here. He won't introduce himself as a mentee. Where's Jamaal at? He won't tell you he's a mentee of mine.
Barber.
Jamaal, no, he studied with me. Yeah, but he doesn't claim, I get his bio, he doesn't even listen to it. He may have the experimental printmaking, but he don't say anything about Curlee in his bio.
Hey, Curlee, who made the phone call?
Yeah, he didn't say anything about Curlee in the bio. Yeah, that's right, Najee made the phone call. Right. But,
That is not true. Ask one of my students,
yes,
gather one up.
that's right.
Ask her what I say about you when I be in class.
All right. But I studied with Master, is that what he says?
I called him a master printer once, and he told me you were a master.
Well, yes. It's not, essentially, I want you to be sensitive to this. There are printers with master's degrees, but that doesn't make them master printers. A master printer is a very specific kind of training. You can say you are a doctor, but if you're a dentist, you're not the same kind of doctor as a neurosurgeon, right? Although you can say you're a doctor. So a master printmaker is someone who is a problem solver for other artists, knows a range of technologies, a range of printmaking mediums, normally not just one. But it's about solving a problem and giving language to the artist, where that language could be presented in an organic way. I remember Mel Edwards brought William T. Williams to my studio one morning. He said, Curlee, I want you to meet William T. Williams. He says, I told William T. that this is the next best place to have me for an artist. And William T. said, well, Curlee, how many prints can I make? I said, well, we like to keep a low edition, you know what I mean? He said, no, how many different prints can I make? So it's about, but this is important in terms of the history of printmaking. These artists were not invited. They were not invited. If you go to these the sites of these main workshops, you seldom see an African American artist, except for contemporary popular artists now. But you go back, you will not see them present. Sam Gilliam, perhaps, at Tandem Press. Yeah. But that's it, because he was the first visiting artist at Tandem Press, and Tandem Press was established by Bill Wiggy in Wisconsin by Sam Gilliam. But after that, other than that, you don't see him. So they would come to me, and I would do exhibitions. I remember someone called me about an exhibition I had in Philadelphia. They said, well, we understand you only print black artists. I said, did you see the exhibit? He said, yeah. I said, well, Richard Anastavis is Polish. Stephen Antonakis is Greek. Kay Walkenstick is Native American. Audrey Flack is Jewish. Because you saw the majority of the artists are African American, you say that you believe I only print African American artists. You see the biases that still exist out there. But what I did realize, I didn't have to invite them. They were going to find me because they were not being invited. And you know why they weren't being invited? Because there was no market for them. Now, there's a market now. Now, there's a high-end market, blue chip market. But for a long time, that blue chip market was only available to Jean Basquiat, perhaps. Yeah. And most don't consider him to be an African American artist. But he has been described by white historians as the only one that broke through. Now, we can name a long list from Bearden and Tanner, but he is considered the only one to break through. Kara Walker maybe after that, but they had no market until later on they began to accept that work, and they got really interested in that multicultural agenda, and they began to buy it, and the museums became embarrassed. Now, they got embarrassed in the 80s and 90s, but if you talk about Benny Andrews and Faith Ringo, in the 50s and 60s, they were marching in front of those museums. Protesting, shutting those museums down, because they wouldn't show artists of color. Or women artists. They'd only show a woman in the museum if she was a nude hanging on the wall. And Faith used to be so pissed off about this. She said, because I marched in front of these museums, Curlee, all night long. And you know who they give the show to? They gave the show to Romare Bearden. Yeah. After I did all that marching. But Bearden was the first one to give the major show to represent this change. But there was no market for them. Now there is a market. I've had galleries tell me that if they weren't showing African American artists right now, they'd be out of business. Out of business. These are major galleries in Chicago and New York would be out of business. But there's a market now. Dr. Robert Steele, who was my predecessor at the Driskell Center, who was a big-time collector, used to tell me, Curlee, we have the secret weapon. We have the black community. And they don't believe they collect art, they don't believe they support our institutions, but they are the ones that keep us going. That was the support behind Sam Gilliam. I was sitting there with Sam, and we'd say, Sam, you know, we talk about someone who won the MacArthur Award for $300,000. Sam said, forget that. You know how many times I've made $300,000, you know? That's enough. And it was a community that was supporting him. I don't need that $300,000. You want me to tell you what? And you know what he did? I mean, I've been to his home and all that, so, you know, I believe him. But the point is that there is an audience and there's a support system. I have one, the Raven Editions. It's the only commercial, African-American owned commercial workshop in the country right now, period. Now, we publish only artists for the marketplace now. I started off nonprofit with the Experimental Printmaking Institute, but we moved to publishing artists that we wanted to support. So we work with a small group. We've done Alfred Conte and some others, but we're interested in really helping them in the marketplace and creating works for the market. But now there's an audience. And it's important that we have our critics, our historians, our promoters, our collectors, and I believe the collectors are as important as anyone, you as collectors. This wouldn't work without you.
That's right.
Wouldn't work without you. Yes?
What do you think are some gems that are here?
Some gems that are hidden?
Here.
Oh, here. Oh, we've got a lot of them here. The problem that you have here is that Najee, because of his breadth of knowledge about African American art, has some classical works by really legacy artists, May Hughes and others, Benny Andrews and others. Those are important to have, but also new talent is important to have as well. And he's producing new talent. He's actually sponsoring new talent. So this is important as well. If you can get a David Driskell, you should get a David Driskell if it's possible. I know another artist that, you know, probably is a great buy. His name is Curlee Holton. I met him. I know what his work is about. No, I'm just messing with you. But I'm saying there are a lot of mid-level and emerging artists you could gather. And it's not so much that they're going to increase in value, which they probably will, but is that you support them at a critical moment so they can continue to practice. It's a validating experience. So I think that's important. And there's a lot of great stuff in here. So it's hard to pick out. Those James Baldwin's plates are really striking to me, and the prints are also.
That's Jamaal, Barber, and Traci Mims.
Jamaal, Barber, and Traci Mims are a good collection. Important. For two reasons. Besides the work being powerful and strong, you know they're going to keep doing the work. They're invested, they're committed to their practice. They're not going to disappear on you. So I think that's important as well. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier something about Afro-Cobra.
Yes.
And some of the things you were talking about how they make an impact on the community as a whole.
Yes.
And some of the things that you mentioned historically has been faced by African American artists in their communities and how they relate to community.
Yeah. By inviting the community to participate, and I think you've done that too, by opening that door and making yourself accessible, that it's not so elite. There used to be a saying when I grew up, this art for art's sake. What we said as African American artists, art for community's sake. Mm-hmm. And that's what Afro-Cobra was about building that community and giving them access to art in a way that they could afford it, in a reasonable way. They did calendars, they did all kinds of things, so they could have access to it. It wasn't about being elite and untouchable. It was about being in their community and relate to them. Colors that related to them, subject matter that related to them. Now, you almost can't get their work.
Right.
The work is $75,000, $80,000 for some of the work.
Yes.
So the institutions now, the galleries now, have gravitated toward their works and discovered them. And Nelson used to tell me, he said, we're discovered now, Curlee. So they're buying all our work. I don't have any work But the commitment was to the
to
community.
the community.
Yeah, but you see it with Jerusha and others, printmakers that are committed to the community and sharing that. The problem also is the teaching. We don't have an opportunity often to teach students of color because you don't get enough. It's always been peculiar to me that you can be in a community that's predominantly black, but so few African Americans are in those classrooms at college. That's always been disappointing. I went to Kent State for my undergraduate degree. My graduate degree. An undergraduate in Cleveland Institute of Art at Case, Western Reserve. Cleveland, Ohio, 50% of the population is black. We're talking about Carl Stokes, Mayor. You're talking about all these major players in Cleveland. History. I was only African American in the classes. How is that possible? Why is that possible? So I've tried to do something about it. So I've just endowed a residency at Kent State University. Curlee Holton Artist in Residency. I did it there and at the Cleveland Institute of Art. And they have to bring in a major artist of color every year. Last year was Willie Cole.
What do you call it?
I brought in Willie Cole. So they pay everything, and I funded that through my family. Because I want it to exist. It's got to exist. So we have to do it. And I know Najee has created a foundation also. So you've got to do it. Because if we don't do it, it will just disappear.
I'm glad because Dave Driskell has invited you to oversee the Driskell Center.
Yeah, they tricked me into doing this. So I started printing David Driskell in 2004. He came into my workshop. He came to Lafayette College to give a talk. And this was amazing because I was teaching African American art history with his books. And here he shows up to come in and do a lecture in my class. So this is history, walking history. So he sees that I'm working with Sam Gilliam and Faith Ringway. He says, Curlee, can I join the club? You know, I want to make prints with them too. So we started printing in 2004. And we've done over 40 different editions together. But they had a search for the director, and it was a failed search. They didn't select a person that they thought was suitable. So the former director says, Curlee, would you consider coming in temporarily? I said, no, man, I got this gig. You don't understand. I run a workshop that I established. I work a couple of days a week. I have an endowed professorship. I was the first African American with an endowed professorship at Lafayette College in history. There were only 3 in the country, and I was one of them. I said, why would I give that up to come to the University of Maryland? He said, oh, just come for a little while until we find someone. I said, well, let me think about it. I said, well, if I could do it for 2 days a week, I might do it. He said, okay. So they interviewed me, and David talked to me and persuaded me, and I went in, and I did 2 days a week for a year, then 3 days a week. While running the workshop in Lafayette, chairman of the art department, and teaching African American history. And before long, they had me full time, so I did 12 years there. And then walked away from it, retired from the secondary, and built a workshop, regular editions. But think about what I'm talking about is relationships, connections. People picking up the phone and calling you, and you picking up the phone and calling someone else. Being generous and being accessible. And I'm not talking about being familiar,
Right.
but being accessible. And that's a different thing. And that's important. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, listen, can we just get one more warm thank you for this This is our second annual print fair. Last year was tremendous. We've gotten off to a fantastic start. Tomorrow, we've got artist demos starting at 2 o'clock with Traci Mims, 3 o'clock with Jamaal, Barber, 4 o'clock with Steve Prince, and Sunday at 1 o'clock we have an artist panel. So we're going all weekend long. Take pictures, tell friends, look at some of the works that's here, find something to connect with. We're glad you're here, and I just want to thank you, Curlee, for coming.
I appreciate it.
And this is my guy. And lastly, there's so many artists that are here. Well, I would like to take the moment and all the artists, whether you're exhibiting in the show or not, let's find some time to get in front of the Black Art in America sign and see if we can make us a historic photograph together. Okay? So if we can just maybe step outside and find, like right now, and take a pic, and then come on in and shop for some art. Let's take some things home, but thank y'all for coming again. Thank you.